Good afternoon and welcome back to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm your host Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. We've been coming to you live from the Singapore FinTech Festival. Joining me for this segment, we have Jesse McWaters. He is the Financial Innovation Lead over at the World Economic Forum. Thank you so much for joining us here today at the FinTech Festival. We're going to discuss ethical AI, and that seems to be a very hot topic at this conference, and I think there's a couple of reasons for it. We were discussing that FinTech is a really big thing in the developing and emerging markets, and they don't want to get left behind, like they may have been in the past. Are you sensing that also?
I think that's absolutely true. And I think one of the exciting things about the developing world and emerging economies is that they're almost charting a new path for what financial services can look like. It's not a lateral story of catch up to where the West is. Whole new models of financial innovation and financial product delivery are being defined.
I would also almost argue it's a leapfrog in some circumstances.
Absolutely, absolutely. I spend a fair bit of time in Shenzhen in China where Ping An and WeChat are headquartered, and it's just remarkable to go there and to see some of the customer-focused innovations that are being deployed.
Well, you focus on regulation and ethics, and there's three main pillars that you follow for that. The first one is being customer experience. Can you explain more of that?
So think about it this way. Traditionally, the average individual hasn't really had access to a lot of high-quality financial advice. It's very expensive. And one of the remarkable things that AI allows us to do is to start to deploy more personalized and useful advice at effectively zero marginal cost. But the challenge of that is, how do we make sure that it's good advice? How do we make sure that it's not impacted by bias? How do we make sure that machine elements aren't learning to collude with each other, as we've actually seen them do in the retail market to a degree around things like eBay? How do we make sure that the advice is high quality, and how do we make sure that it's appropriately regulated?
Right.
Does an AI need to be a fiduciary? Can it even be a fiduciary? These are the types of questions that we're asking.
It's really interesting. I had someone join me back at the MarketSite studio in New York earlier in the week, and he was trying to explain AI to me in a more understandable manner, if you will. He was like, AI learns to figure out, they'll show you a number of pictures, identify a cat. Yeah. My question was, what if it's a dog in a cat costume? Right? And it sounds very trivial, but those are some of the problems that AI is trying to solve.
It's absolutely right. And I think that one of the real challenges in AI is that we tend to imagine that things that are easy for us are easy for the machine. And so you might train a system to be able to identify cats and to identify jaguars. And then you might say, okay, well, tell me what is an ocelot. And then you tell it, well, an ocelot is like, it's kind of in between a cat and a jaguar. Right. The machine is terrible at figuring that out, whereas a 5-year-old child would probably be able to intuit what to do.
Now, what about underwriting and decisioning? That's the second pillar. What's up?
So I think that we have an opportunity with AI to deploy models that are better at predicting future states. So whether or not somebody might default on a loan is a great example of this, right? And so we're getting better underwriting and adjudication capabilities around things like lending and insurance. And that's wonderful, because it allows us to include people who might previously have been excluded from the system. Thin file holders, people who've recently come to the country and maybe don't have an extensive credit record, or people who've turned a corner in terms of how they operate their financial lives. But the challenge is that if we just start throwing data in, we might not have a good understanding of whether bias is creeping in. And in the US in particular, where there are really strong laws around fair lending and disparate impact, it's really important to have a theory, at least, for how the factors you're introducing into the model influence its actual decision making.
Right. Yeah, and the final one is systemic and prudential risk.
So, I mean, we want a financial system that is safe, sound, as well as fair and inclusive. And I think one of the interesting things about AI is that the attempts to deploy it are driving us towards a more deeply interconnected financial system. So think about something like image recognition. Banks aren't trying to build those image recognition capabilities from scratch. They're going to large technology firms in order to access them. Same with optical character recognition and other sort of text-to-speech capabilities. These are things that you don't want to have to build those from scratch yourselves. Folks like Google and Microsoft have already done a great job of it. But that means that the financial system is becoming more complex. It's becoming more interconnected.
Even more complex.
And there's a feature of AI that first movers who were able to get a virtuous data cycle up and running, they're able to scale very quickly, and they're able to retain and defend that scale. And so that creates challenges around antitrust, but it also creates challenges around, can we understand how to prevent runaway crises and cascade effects? Now, we can figure this out, right? We figure out operational risk all of the time, but it's challenging in an environment that's so technical and in an environment where regulators around the world are diverging in terms of their policies, particularly around data usage and portability, the key inputs to making these AI models work.
Okay, Jesse, thank you so much for joining us at the FinTech Festival.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me throughout the day. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.